Alright, so I'm steaming through Anne Rice's Mayfair Witches trilogy, and I'm now on the second book, Lasher. I have to say, this is definitely a step down for me in comparison to the previous book, The Witching Hour, but it's still a really good book, and I'm looking forward to talking about it. Unfortunately, the things that really bugged me about the book were the most spoilery things, so in this review there are going to be spoilers, so if spoilers bother you, please don't watch any further. Alright, let's get started. Part 1. Summary. The Lives of the Mayfair Witches is a trilogy which chronicles the lives of the Mayfair family, a large coven, many of whom possess supernatural gifts. The Mayfair family's fortunes have been tied to their connection with an ancient spirit known as Lasher, who haunts many of the family members, but mostly he is the companion of the designee of the Mayfair legacy, a female descendant whose ancestors go right back to the first Mayfair witch, Suzanne, who first summoned Lasher. In The Witching Hour, Rowan Mayfair became the designee of the Mayfair legacy, and with her lover, Michael Curry, took ownership of the Mayfair family home. Their whirlwind romance was cut short when Rowan decided to sleep with Lasher, allowing him to impregnate her with himself, thus making himself human. Rowan and Lasher flee the Mayfair mansion at the end of The Witching Hour, leaving Michael Curry distraught and seriously ill. In Lasher, the now human Lasher begins to impregnate other Mayfair women, with the hopes of creating more of his own species, which is said to be superior to the human race. These attempts result in the deaths of several Mayfair women, and even Rowan's own life is left in the balance. The Mayfair family must come together and learn the origins of Lasher and stop him. Part 2. Structure, plot, and world building. So let's start off by talking about the negative things, and as I go through the review, things will get more positive. The weakest part for me with Lasher is how unfocused and unstructured it was in comparison to the first book. The Witching Hour ends on quite the cliffhanger, and so going into this book, you're expecting a lot of follow-up and a lot of action on the back of that. But actually Rice really does take her time with developing the plot points from the previous book. In fact, many of the main players from the previous book play very minimal roles in the first parts of the book, and some play barely any role at all. Now for me, this really did kill the tension. We spend a lot of time focusing on new characters who I'll talk about a bit later, and these characters just aren't as interesting or as engaging as the characters from the first book. With The Witching Hour, I felt like Rice did a great job of balancing the world building and backstory stuff and the character studies with a plot. And one of the ways that she did this was tell the story in these discrete parts. You had, the whole part that was on the history of the Mayfair Witches. You had the first part which was setting up Rowan and Michael and their stories, and you had the third part dealing with their marriage and relationship, and the final part dealing with, the stuff around Lasher and his eventual birth. Now this structure meant that Rice could get involved in lots of different kinds of storytelling. She could do the kind of tangential world-building backstory stuff, but she could also do the more plot-heavy stuff in the present day. With Lasher there isn't this clear structure. Instead we just kind of have a meandering sort of structure, where we're following a character for a while, we might get a bit of backstory, a bit of this, a bit of that, we might get a bit of plot moving, or we might not, and so it just felt much harder to follow the story, because the structure just wasn't there. Unlike the first novel that really felt like Rice had really thought about it and everything was expertly placed, with Lasher it felt like she was just going more instinctively, and that is good in some parts, but in other parts it can just leave things floundering a bit. Now when it comes to expanding the Mayfair mythology in this book, I think Rice does a good job in some areas and not so good a job in other areas. She introduces some new witch characters that we didn't really see in the first book, in particular the characters of Ancient Evelyn, who is someone who has been around since the time of Stella and Julian, and so she can provide a bit more insight into that story, and also Mona, who is a 13-year-old witch, who has a very interesting storyline that I'll get to in the next part. With Ancient Evelyn, I felt like this was a good addition to the story, because it showed you that there is more to the Mayfair history than we got from the first book, and there are things that the Talamasca just doesn't even know about, which did keep the mystery around the Mayfair Witches going and interesting when we were going through more flashbacks in this book. With Ancient Evelyn, we got a much more personal connection to characters like Stella, who Ancient Evelyn had a relationship with. We also get a similar sort of thing going with Julian, who appears again in this story in the present day as a ghost. Julian tells Michael some aspects of his relationship with Lasher, and also he tells us some aspects of his relationship with his mother and grandmother. And we also get him talking about his relationships to other Mayfair witches, like Marguerite and Mary Beth, and all of this stuff does give us a much more personal insight into the relationships and the dynamics between the Mayfair witches. In the first book, much of the story came through the Talamasca, and so it could be a bit clinical, some of the stories that we got told. You know, it was more like a character biography than, say, a personal, intimate story. Whereas having Julian tell some of the history and having Ancient Evelyn remembering the history just gives it that personal touch, and I think that was a really nice dimension to the history of the Mayfair witches. All that said, these passages of Ancient Evelyn reminiscing about Stella and these parts of Julian telling his story, they do involve recounting a lot of information that we've already heard, and this does slow the story down a lot. Especially Julian's story, which takes up a reasonable amount of space. You know, you are hearing things that you've heard before, and while you do get new information, and that information is important because it adds information about Lasher that we need to know as readers, it can become a bit stagnant after a while, especially given how long this novel and the first novel was. And finally, one of the biggest backstories that we get in this book is Lasher's story told from his own mouth. Unfortunately, I actually thought this was one of the weakest parts of the book. Lasher's story just didn't have the personal touches that Julian's story had. I wasn't really interested in Lasher's backstory and the characters that were in that backstory because they all just seemed not as fleshed out and not as full as the characters in the Mayfair family. I also felt like in this book Lasher really lost his magnetism and his malevolence. In the first book, Lasher is just this force that's very ambiguous. It's not clear in the book whether Lasher is a force for good or evil, or if he's somewhere in between. And I felt like in this book, Lasher did turn out to be really just a villain, and also just he lost that aura of mystery around him, and he didn't really feel like much of a threat either. For those of you that read the Vampire Chronicles, I would say that Lasher has a very similar character arc to Akasha, the Queen of the Damned. Both Akasha and Lasher have a very similar arc in that both of them have a book where they are kind of built up as these all-powerful beings. And in both cases, when the showdown finally happens, Akasha and Lasher are dispatched pretty quickly and pretty easily. And it kind of lets you down because, you know, these characters are built up as being, you know, in Akasha's case, she's meant to be the Queen of the Damned. She's meant to be one of the most powerful vampires ever. And in Lasher's case, he's meant to belong to this superior race, the Taltos. And for them just to be killed so easily and quickly just seems a bit out of step with what we know about them. And that being said, it was also a bit of a plot twist, because I was expecting Lasher to be the main villain throughout the trilogy, and for Rice to just bump him off at this point was a pretty ballsy move, so I'd be interested to see where the next book goes, given that Lasher is gone. Or maybe he'll come back, who knows. Now, because when there's a negative thing in a book, I do generally like to try and work out, well, why might this thing be there? And there's one explanation that I've come up with for why Lasher might have this anticlimactic ending. Perhaps the tragedy of Lasher as a character is that he is this very powerful spirit, and over time, his connection with the Mayfair witches, he's built up this power over the years. And he's yearning and yearning to become human because he thinks that this will make him even more powerful. And ultimately, when he becomes human, he actually becomes a lot weaker, and actually it would have been better for him to have just stayed as a spirit. And since looking at Lasher's character arc in that way helps me appreciate this book a little bit more, I'm just going to go with that interpretation. But let me know in the comments what you think about Lasher's story and his character arc. Part 3. Michael, Mona, and Rowan. Keeping with the complaining, let's look at the three main characters in this book, Michael, Rowan, and Mona. And let's start with Rowan. So I was really shocked by how much Rowan was just shafted in this book. I don't have an issue per se with what happens to her in terms of, you know, getting put in this coma for a long period of time. But what I found frustrating was the end of the first book. You have this build-up with Rowan's character. She is convinced that she can control Lasher and use him for her ends. And so she makes this big decision to run away with Lasher at the end of the book. And I was really expecting this book to spend a lot of time dwelling on the consequences of that. You know, spending a few chapters of Rowan realizing that she's made a mistake and seeing her slowly fall from grace. Now, we do get a bit of that, but when the book starts, Rowan is already in a terrible state. So we don't really see what's going on, and we just get a bit of flashback. And I felt like this was a real missed opportunity, because that was such a big thing for Rowan's character to do at the end of the first book. And for her just to be kind of glossed over almost, to focus on other things, did seem a bit poor to me. I would say that this was probably the thing that I disliked the most in the book overall, because I just felt like it was a missed opportunity. Now on to another controversial part of the book, and this is Mona Mayfair's character and what she does with Michael. So Mona is basically the replacement Rowan, I guess, for this book. She's a 13-year-old Mayfair witch, and she's very mature for her age. In fact, she's so mature that she ends up sleeping with Michael. And this, to me, was just really out of character and weird. Now, Rice does and always has covered taboo topics in her books, and I don't think these things should be off limits, and I think sometimes she covers these taboo topics really well. However, in this particular case, I just wasn't convinced by Michael and Mona doing what they did. It seemed really out of character for Michael to do this. It felt like more of a shock value thing than a serious plot point. Maybe it's going to have ramifications in the third book. I mean, given that we've killed Lasher, maybe this is going to be a big thing in the third book. But even then, you need to do a bit of work to set up a decision like that, and I just didn't get it. It made no sense to me. The only way I could rationalise it was maybe Mona is using her powers to seduce Michael, but if that's the case, then she didn't do it intentionally because there was nothing in the prose that suggested that. So yeah, I felt like that was just really off base and weird, and not in a good way, and I would much rather it just not have been there at all. But given that this is one of the more controversial parts of the book, what do you think about it? It's interesting because of, what it is. What do you think about having these kinds of things in books altogether? Do you think that Rice did motivate it in some way? Do you think there's an explanation for it? Let me know in the comments, because I think there's a lot to discuss there. Part 4. Pro-choice, anti-eugenics. Alright, now for a bit of an analysis of the book. So another controversial thing in this book is the way that women get treated. Lasher's main goal in this book is to spread his seed. And so he's going and sleeping with these Mayfair witches in order to impregnate them because their genetics are powerful enough, potentially, to actually bear children for him. But unfortunately, the women who he tries to conceive with always die. So what you have in this book is a lot of women just being used as vehicles or receptacles for Lasher and then dying, and that can seem to some people quite problematic. Even Rowan herself in this book is just reduced to a pregnant woman, and then she has a coma when she gives birth to her daughter Emilith, and then she's out of action for most of the book. Now, as I was listening to the book, I was doing a lot of thinking about what Rice might be doing here and what the story might tell us. And I actually think it has some very interesting things to say about pregnancy, abortion, and eugenics. I think what Lasher shows really starkly, and maybe for some people it's too grim, but it really shows how brutal and powerful pregnancy is, and how it really does take over and destroy women's bodies. Now, of course, it's not saying that pregnancy is exactly like this. It shows in this gothic and extreme way how pregnancy can just take over a woman's entire autonomy. Even a character like Rowan, who in the previous book is like one of the most powerful witches, is reduced to a coma when she's impregnated. So, she literally does lose her autonomy. She can't do anything. And the other women who are less powerful than her don't even get that privilege. They just die. Now, that can definitely be uncomfortable for a reader, and if you like to see female characters being more than just that, that might be frustrating. But I think seeing it in this way, seeing it as a book that's showing you how brutal pregnancy can be and how it can control a woman's life in that way, is actually quite interesting. And also, when you see it through that lens, then I think the end of the novel becomes even more satisfying. So at the very end of the novel, Rowan's child, Emilith, who is the daughter of her and Lasher, returns to the Mayfair house and finds her mother, Rowan, in bed in this coma. Emilith then feeds Rowan from her breast, and this feeding revives Rowan. And when Rowan wakes up, she tells Michael to kill Emilith. He can't do it, so she takes the gun and she just shoots Emilith straight in the face. Now, I wasn't expecting that at all to happen. It was incredibly brutal, and I thought it was a pretty fantastic and shocking way to end the book. But I really thought this was interesting, keeping on with that abortion theme, because you have basically a role reversal at the end of the story. You have the mother taking suck from the child and then just shooting the child and, just cutting off that link altogether. Rowan is able to basically get the ultimate revenge on the child that's potentially destroyed and ruined her body. Now, that is a very dark ending, and saying it out loud might make Rowan seem like a very cruel person. But at this more symbolic level, I actually thought that was genius. All throughout the book, these women are just being basically used as birthing machines for these children that are killing them. And at the end of the novel, one of these women is able to turn the tables on those children, take its power from it rather than have it take its power from her, and then just dispose of it. So I think seeing the novel through that lens makes this plot point way more interesting, and definitely has a lot to say there about abortion and bodily autonomy for women. I also think that the book could be interpreted as an argument against eugenics. Rice always seems to have this thing where she enjoys the supernatural and paranormal, but she also loves science fiction. She loves Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and all that, and she always tries to fuse the two, and she does that in the Mayfair Witches a lot. Lasher isn't just a mystical spirit, he is the spirit of a different species, a species that's potentially superior to the human species. And Lasher's ultimate philosophy is that he should replace the human species with his species because it's superior, it's better, and so people should be willing to, carry his children. It's an honor to carry his children because you're basically, uplifting the human race. And again, in reducing women in the way that the book does, it just shows you how cruel eugenics is as a philosophy. You're basically saying you only have value insofar as you can give me, the best possible children. Otherwise, you're essentially worthless. And we don't even care necessarily if you survive the pregnancy because it's your offspring that we care about. And this is ultimately why Lasher and his daughter Emilith can't live. It's because they have this philosophy. They see themselves as this master race, and they would quite happily just wipe everyone else out in order to create that master race. So ultimately, I do think this book has some very interesting things to say, perhaps even more so than the first book. The stuff around pregnancy, around bodily autonomy, and around eugenics is just so prominent, and I just think that, like I say, that ending of the role reversal between the mother and the child, I just thought was really great, and possibly the best moment for me so far in the whole series. Part 5, Conclusion. So overall, I do think that Lasher is still a good book in the Mayfair Witches trilogy, but as a novel, I don't think it compares The Witching Hour, which for me is just a classic. That being said, I think it does have some very interesting things to say about pregnancy, about abortion, about bodily autonomy and eugenics, which maybe the first book didn't do as much. But that being said, the story that it tells and the way it tells it, I think could have been a lot better. Lasher just doesn't feel as well structured as the Mayfair Witches. It seems to meander in places. We do get more background and backstory with the Mayfair Witches, but it can be repetitive at times. And finally, some major characters get majorly sidelined in this book, and some of the newer characters are a little bit weird, and some of the character decisions are just completely crazy. And lastly, although I do think there might be an explanation for why this happens, I do think that Lasher as a villain is just less convincing in this book, and his dispatch is just too quick and too easy, given that he's meant to be, this is meant to be a superior race, and whack him on the head with a hammer and we're done with it. That being said, I still thought this was a great book. I think it has some very interesting things to say, and I'm looking forward to carrying on with Taltos very soon. Alright, that's it for this video. Let me know what you think of Lasher. I know that there is a trend for people to really love The Witching Hour and to not like Lasher, or maybe Lasher's like the middle ground one and really not like Taltos. So let me know what you think of this book. Also let me know what you thought about what I said there about how the book might be saying something interesting about abortion, about bodily autonomy, and about eugenics. I do think there's lots of interesting stuff there, so I'd really like to have those discussions with you in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel. I post new videos every Monday at 4 PM. But that's it for this video, so take care everyone, see you all next time.